And I'm going to introduce now our next keynote speaker, who's someone, bye-bye, Lisa, someone I guess most of you already know because he's kind of a celebrity of our world. Yes, you are, Jeff. This is Jeff Jarvis. He's the director. I will say this in Spanish. I'm sorry. I hope I'm not messing with the translator. And now to the audience. Jeff es el director de CUNY, de la Universidad de la Ciudad de Nueva York y del Town Knight Center for Entrepreneurial Journalism en Nueva York. También dirige en este momento la maestría en periodismo social que se está desarrollando en CUNY, es algo nuevo, y es un blogger intensivo en buzzmachine.com, lo pueden seguir ahí. También fue consultor para medios como el Guardian, Digital First y muchos otros, y fue el creador y el primer editor jefe de Entertainment Weekly. Así que tiene todas las credenciales, y como si eso fuera poco, hace unos días tiró un artículo polémico para sacudirnos un poco a los periodistas y ponernos en alerta, diciendo que los periodistas deberíamos aprender de cómo la comunidad científica estuvo compartiendo datos y abriendo información en estos meses de pandemia, algo que, según Jeff, los periodistas todavía no sabemos hacer tan bien, así que ahora le vamos a pedir que nos rete en público y nos diga qué es lo que tendríamos que hacer mejor. Con ustedes es un honor tener en la Media Party a Jeff Jarvis. Adelante, Jeff.
Muchísimas gracias, Sonia y Mariano. Buenos días todos. And now I switch to English because that's much safer for me. Thank you for having me. I'm honored. I'm delighted that you've done Media Party this year. I miss you all. I miss the company. I miss the talk. I miss the city. I miss the steaks. I miss the Malbec. But I'm glad that we have the conversations here in Media Party. It's one of the great conferences in the world, and thank you for holding it. 2 years ago, when I had the honor to appear on the stage at Media Party, I apologized for what America was doing to the world with Donald Trump. I only apologize more today for what the mess that we are in. But I realized when the COVID pandemic started that we were facing a different enemy. That before, the enemy was misinformation and disinformation and trolls and bots and Russians. And now in the disease, the enemy is, as we've long seen, ignorance. The public doesn't know about the disease. The scientists are learning about the disease. And so I realized that our job as journalists needed to change. And the way I saw it was that we needed to amplify expertise, that the cure to ignorance is expertise, and we need to find the experts. So I went onto Twitter and I started looking for the scientists who are working on COVID. And it was quite amazing to see how quickly I could put together a list of 600 epidemiologists, virologists, infectious disease doctors, public health officials, and so on. If you go to bit.ly/COVID Twitter list, bit.ly/COVID Twitter list, you'll find that Twitter list there. And in following these doctors, I've been really quite amazed at what I've learned from them about the open information ecosystem that the internet provides. That's really what I want to talk about today briefly. What I found was that the scientists realized they needed open information, right? And so they used preprint servers. That is to say, they put their papers up on these servers before they were peer reviewed. And there are a few tens of thousands of papers on COVID now up there, which are pretty amazing. Some are good and some are bad. It's a lot of information. So the second thing they needed to do was to have mechanisms to find the relevant papers. And they created mechanisms to do that, tools on top of the preprint servers to search. The third thing they needed to do, which was absolutely critical, was to provide peer review. Because these papers were not yet put into journals and did not have the scientific methodology of peer review, the scientists needed to review them, and they used Twitter. I just love the fact that scientists gravitated to Twitter to perform peer review at the speed of the net. The fourth thing they needed to do was to review their peers. They needed to figure out who was worth listening to and who wasn't worth listening to. And that's been a fascinating process to watch as well. Not to pick on one guy, but I will. There's one man on Twitter named Dr. Eric Feigl Ding. And most of the scientists I follow don't like what he does on Twitter because he traffics in clickbait. He tries to get things that are said in dramatic ways so he'll get more traffic. And they knock him down constantly for this, which is to say that they can recognize each other. The fifth thing they need to do is to use social media to go over the barrier and explain things to the public, especially when the press does a bad job of explaining it. So what I saw happen in a matter of weeks with COVID was once again that the scientists and doctors adapted to these tools to perform the functions they needed in an open information ecosystem. And they did it better than we in journalism have after decades, which is sobering, I think, to say that they have done a better job. They've had peer review since Cicero. They've adapted the tools that come as they need to do these functions, and then they find out ways to do it. We should have done such a good job as the scientists have done. And I think the problem is that we didn't try to adapt. We tried to protect. We tried to keep the same functions that we did as journalists and then bring them into the internet rather than seeing the new ways that we could do things. So what can we learn from the scientists and what can we learn from this episode in journalism? One is, I think, how we cover science and understanding that science is a process. We in journalism tend to think that the latest word is the last word, that if there's a paper that comes out today, that's the final word. Well, of course, that's not how science operates. It operates in the context of its history. It operates by having prior questions that have been answered, new questions that are raised, and more questions yet to be answered. That is how to cover COVID. But I've seen some bad examples of this. I'm going to pick on the New York Times only because they're the best we have in America, alongside the Washington Post. We want them to be better, so I'll pick on them. So I saw one case where a paper came out that was very, very controversial. It was being used by the Trumpists to say that COVID's not so bad and the shutdown shouldn't occur. And the New York Times reported on this paper and they only quoted the author of the paper. Well, my scientists on my Twitter list went nuts because they said you should never do that. You should always find others who have other views of this paper, other experts, and provide context. The New York Times didn't do that. The scientists on Twitter did. This controversial paper had been peer-reviewed on Twitter by 5 scientists I followed within hours. It wouldn't have been hard at all for the Times to have found these other voices. The Times also gave over its op-ed space to a diet doctor who also said, maybe this thing isn't so bad, maybe the shutdown shouldn't happen. This was months ago. And the epidemiologists in my feed went nuts again, saying, why did you hand over this valuable space to a diet doctor rather than to an expert? So another thing we have to learn in journalism, I think, is to do a better job of sourcing, of finding the right expert for the right question. Every morning on television, on MSNBC in the US, they have on Dr. Dave to talk about the pandemic. Dr. Dave is a spinal surgeon. What the hell does a spinal surgeon have to say about a virus? This is what journalism does too often. So another lesson I think that I've learned is the need to amplify voices. First, in this case, to amplify expertise, to find those experts, and that we in journalism use the power we have to retweet them, to write about them, to find others. But in science, there's been a problem, is that the New York Times, one more time, did a story about the heroes of COVID from around the world. They were all white men from Europe and America. And women scientists properly went nuts, as they well should have, and wrote a brilliant letter to the Times educational supplement in London, saying that when you do not have diverse voices, when you do not have women and people of color from science on, you miss perspective, which leads to another lesson, is that one thing that we have done terribly in our world is to not have seen the inequity in health and the inequity in the economy. What both COVID and the murder of George Floyd in America have brought out is the systemic racism that has been here forever, that every African-American could tell you was here, that old white men like me weren't so aware of, but came out from this time. And so what we've got to do too is amplify the voices of those communities that are affected. That is a high responsibility we have. This disease has taken on African Americans and Latino Americans in far greater proportion in disease and death. And it's an economic story as well. And the pandemic teaches us that that's what we must do. I think it's also important then to recognize the scientific method as a methodology for journalism, to see that we put forward a hypothesis, we read the context and history of what came before, and we figure out what questions need to be asked and answered. We answer them in that context. We don't do that in journalism. We think every story is complete in and of itself. But in a story like the pandemic, in a story like systemic racism in America, we see that it is a long process, and we need to cover it as that. One more point to make is that I think we also need to serve communities differently. A woman named Fiona Lowenstein, who suffered from COVID herself, she was the editor of a site called Body Politic, which is a queer feminist site around health. And she recognized that there were other people who had COVID and had long-term effect from it. So she started a small group on Instagram, but quickly it got too big for that. She moved it to WhatsApp. Within one day, it got too big for that. And now it is on Slack with 14,000 people, last I knew, who are sharing their needs, sharing their information, holding events, doing all kinds of wonderful things. This is not a story that we write. This is not us extracting the news from a community. This is us trying to find the ways to do journalism in new ways. So finally, let me just say this. I've been asked about what happens to the business of journalism after COVID. Well, the way I put it is that the business of journalism was already a house on fire, and COVID threw gunpowder on the flames. And yes, it's exploding. And yes, things are going to go away. And we're going to find ashes. But my hope is we can rebuild journalism from those ashes, that we have new sprouts rising. At my school, the Newmark School, this is why we started with Carrie Brown, a program in social journalism to utterly rethink journalism from the perspective of communities. We also are just now starting a new version of our entrepreneurial program, which will concentrate on individual journalists who are resilient in the field. That is to say, they may not work for big publications. They may not be freelancers. They may serve people through a Substack newsletter and a YouTube site and a Medium site and events when we can have those again, or virtual events, or books, or education, or all kinds of ways. And they'll make money, we hope, from Patreon, from Kickstarter, from YouTube, from Medium, and try to be able to support their journalism. So we're starting that program now. And I think what's going to happen is we're going to see large institutions go away, not all of them, but some will. And then we're going to find a lot of unemployed journalists, and we have to help them, I think, serve communities in new ways. It's controversial in the US, but right now all of our major newspaper chains are controlled or owned by hedge funds or families who are tired of spending money. The innovation is not going to come from those big companies anymore, I'm sorry to say. It is going to come, I think, from individual journalists who put themselves at risk financially and otherwise, who don't have a clear mandate of how to operate yet, because we don't know yet, but who are going to be determined to do journalism. And so the question is how we help them do that, how we rebuild journalism from the ashes and rethink what we do. And the one thing that I hope we do at the same time, whether it's the individual journalists or whether it's the institutions, it is time that we must recognize the need to rethink every area of coverage in journalism through the lens of equity. How the hell can we ever cover health again without recognizing what we learned in COVID about the fundamental racist inequity of the system? How can we cover the economy and business and employment without looking at it through the lens of inequity? How can we cover culture? When Chadwick Boseman died a few weeks ago, if you looked at Black media and Black Twitter, it was a momentous event of someone who mattered greatly that was played down 3/4 of the way down the page in white media. So we extract from African-American culture and we don't give back when it matters. We've got to rethink every single area of coverage in the idea of inequity. And I say that as an old white man who has much to learn. But now is our opportunity. Now that we are in this period of tremendous change, let's change journalism. So thank you very much for your kind attention and for joining in Media Party. It's a great event that needs our support.
I'm mute. Bravo. We give you an applause. Thank you very much. If I read you well, I think you are asking us journalists to be less arrogant. So that's quite a hard thing to do.
I said that arrogantly, I know, but yes.
At the same time, yes, you're right. But yes, because you're asking us to do peer review, to bring the right experts and to include new voices. And that's in a sense is trying to move a little back to a little bit to the back ourselves and let others bring in their opinions. But do you think, is it possible to actually do peer review when you are with all the when you need to publish very quickly, when you are pressed by the news, and maybe you feel you don't have time to wait for the opinions of other journalists before you publish?
It's not even just the opinions of other journalists, it's also finding enough experts. When the Times did that story about that controversial paper, I went looking to, let's say, what the San Jose Mercury did. San Jose Mercury has shrunk miserably because because of the business, and it's owned by a hedge fund. I found a journalist there who did a spectacular job of covering the same paper. She went and found the history of that scientist and how he was being used by the Trumpists. She went and found other scientists who commented on that paper. No, we can do good journalism all the time. And I think that the crush of being required to turn out blog post after blog post after blog post after blog post is exactly what you're saying is the problem. And we've got to resist that crush for attention and volume as best we can.
Excellent, will do. And I'm happy you asked us to rebuild journalism because you've been in the Media Party many times that we always talk about rebooting journalism. So that's what we would like to do and we will try to do. So thank you so much again, Jeff. Hope to see you soon. Please stay at home.
I can't wait to see Charo, my friend Charo. She's brilliant.
Charo is coming. So yes, you should stay definitely.